plenty of time to put them on the grill.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Christopher.
Perhaps I could ask about gun stones.
Okay.
How are they made? Are they uniform? Is there a sort of process, and who does it?
Yeah, I mean, I assume Kay probably has a lot to say about this, but based on my knowledge of the documentary sources, I know it's not quite the same as the artefacts. They're carved by masons who are paid a sort of set rate for making particular types of gunstones, but they're different sizes because the guns themselves are at different size themselves. So, for instance, in the 1428 campaign, we know that the bombards in that campaign sort of range from about, I think, 14 inches in diameter. The gunstones, I think, up until about 18 or even possibly higher. So they ranged quite a bit. So you'd have to have made gunstones to fit the guns, obviously, or otherwise you might have struggled to use it. But,
I can fill in a little bit. If you so long ago, I've forgotten it all. But actually, in the Burgundian sources that Kelly and I use for Abercon Burgundian source, there's actually evidence that they used a wheel. They were turning them with a wheel and doing it and cutting them to get them spherical and whatever. Completely obvious as you do. And then one of the things I found very, very interesting too, slightly later period, but is the use of formers. Size things. I've forgotten what you call them. Yeah, but no, they used a piece of wood with a hole in it, and it's very evident. All the time that stones were being used, they were using these to check. As soon as cast iron, a gauge, thank you, gauge. And as soon as cast iron came in, it didn't matter because cast iron was always the same. But there is lots of evidence of them using I think it's in. We published it. I think used a cartwheel, and the biggest payments are for resharpening the chisels continually.
Yeah. Highly skilled trade, actually. In the 14th century, the gunstone makers were being paid 8p a day, which is more than anybody else in the armaments industry. It was that difficult when they're making them for the privy wardrobe in the reign of Richard II.
Artillery was expensive. I think that's one of the things. This is something you've always got to factor in. It's not something you can put together quickly.
Yes. Two questions for Kay, if I may. First of all, the ammunition. You mentioned gunstones and iron balls. There are these funny little lead cannonballs with cuboid iron inside them. So what are they? How do they fit within the grand scheme of things? What are they for? And the second question is on gunpowder and its composition. You mentioned serpentine and corned powder. But what actually goes into it? Does it change? Is it sodium nitrate as opposed to potassium nitrate?
Oh dear. The first question is these guns, ammunition made of composite materials, lead with iron in and things like that. A lot started coming up from Mary Rose. I don't think it's really still completely understood why. The current theory is that it was done to adjust the weight. I'm not completely convinced about that. They saw it as important, and I honestly don't know why. They seem to become prevalent in the 16th century, but that might only be the result of the evidence that we have.
They had some funds in the Bosworth.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. Yeah, well, okay, for 1485. Yes, that's right.
The long 16th century.
The long 16th century. Thank you, Tom. But it is still a question, and there is still a lot of questions about ammunition because there are a lot of composites and a lot of different types. Just very, very briefly, just going back though to stone and iron, when we did the experiments at the Royal Armies where we actually were able to fire stone and iron shot properly at a sort of wooden side of a ship, the iron punched a hole as clean as a whistle through it. It's like taking a paper punch to it. And the stone went through and shattered the wood, so in fact it was completely covered in shards and things. Gunpowder is a mixture of charcoal, sulphur and potassium nitrate. The idea that it could be sodium nitrate has been put forward a lot, The problem with sodium nitrate is if I put sodium nitrate on my hand, in the space I'm now talking to you and taking about 30 to 40 seconds, I'd have a pool of water on my hand. It absorbs, it's one of the most highly what's called deliquescent materials surviving, and it absorbs water very quick. So it has to be potassium nitrate. We started off our work 10 years ago looking at different compositions because people get very fixated about different compositions and about how getting different compositions means you get better and worse powder. The problem is gunpowder doesn't work like that. It's not only due to its composition, it's also due to the amount it's contained within a container. And for example, our very first experiments, we put some very, very, very low nitrate, poor powder, and we put a very tight stopper on it. And it went off with the most almighty bang you wouldn't believe, because of what I was trying to show you is because it was constrained. So gunpowder is actually a very, very complex material. I want to do a lecture one day, and I don't know how you do it, but I could give you an example with same gunpowder mixture. Choose any mixture you like, let's say 75, 15, 10, and you put pile here, and I set light to it, and it would just fill the room with smoke. That's what. In fact, you put it on your hand, it would disappear. I take the same powder, precisely put it in a handgun, I'd shoot you dead, and I put exactly the same powder, and if you know precisely how to use it, put it in a rocket, it'll go whoosh into the sky, all with the same powder. So, and what I'm trying to say is that's a very, very complex material.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, it's a bit too long of an answer, perhaps.
Okay, if you ever do that lecture, I want to be there. Can you not put the go me?
No, sorry, excuse me, I'm sorry.
I'm interested by the shift to metal, and I'm wondering about calibre, the concept of calibre. How long is the period between your pioneering work, or the pioneering of metal shots, and the idea of calibre, which obviously implies standardisation, which means shot can be shared between various guns, which, to my mind, establishes the sort of technology whereby it's not surprising the technology remains stable for such a long time. Is there a long period between first shot and calibre?
The problem is, I'm not a believer in standardisation. It's very difficult to explain quickly. I don't believe they sort of made guns and they instantly said, right, we'll have a cannon which is a demi-culverin, which is always an 18-pounder and always with a ball this size. I don't know if you noticed those two 1488 guns, you wouldn't have realised it or whatever. They're precisely the same calibre and they're different lengths. And that goes right through the period, almost until, well, certainly the 18th century. They were making cannon and they weren't as fixated as we are on standardisation, and I don't know how they coped with it, but it didn't worry them. Do you see what I mean? They weren't sort of thinking, right, I've got this long thin gun, I can make a gun that fires a 16 kilo bore, therefore I'll make all my cannon like that. You tend to find, well, they bought all their cannon a bit like that, but one was firing a 20-pound bore, one was firing an 18-pound bore, one was firing a 19-pound bore, one was firing a 17-pound bore. And they coped, and I'm not entirely sure why or how. So it isn't an answer to your question, but you see, there isn't standardisation, I don't believe.
But
well, there is when you go and look at the artillery manuals and you go and look at what's written down, but when you go and look at the artefacts, no, none at all.
Do you mind if I jump in with slightly contrary?
No, please do.
Maybe because I'm based on looking at the documents rather than you saying, for instance, in the 1497 campaign to Scotland, they're very detailed, these accounts from the Master of the Ordnance, and they actually specify the weight of shot and the weight of powder per shot for each individual type of gun, and they seem to be, there's a grid standardisation there. Yeah. With
but
the
then
Curtos and
that may be, and then you'll look 5 years later and you'll find the guns they were making were completely different and different sizes, and it wasn't like you're deciding on a standardisation which you then run across.
So maybe
I'm not saying that it doesn't apply in small areas, but it doesn't apply across the board. And I think part of the problem, there's two things I often answer that question with. One is standardisation in manufacturing terms didn't start until Colt, 1860 or something.
In terms of actual factory made,
really standardisation, interchangeable. It's a 19th century concept on the one hand.
on the other hand, production of things according to the pattern that the Tower generically liked
That's true.
was going as a standard phrase by the middle of the 17th century.
But again, they weren't interchangeable.
But
in any
those
way.
aren't interchangeable,
Yeah,
those are
yeah.
individually tailored
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
Though, as we discovered with the armours, which the back and breastplates are all marked with little construction marks that show which backplate goes with which breastplate, because they're all handmade.
Yeah.
But in point of fact, if you just grab a backplate and a breastplate, because they're all roughly the same, you can actually wear them. You don't
Yeah.
need to wear them as
That's right.
the actual pairs in which they were lovingly manufactured. I would say one other thing
Yeah,
about
yeah.
that,
Mm.
which is that the Ottoman artillerists, who were amongst the best in the world, arguably, in the late 15th and early 16th century, wrote long essays on their guns, saying exactly how much powder and what size ball to put in each gun
Yes, they did. And my contention is
on
that...
an individual basis.
Yeah, and the other thing that happens is you get a lot of people writing artillery books in the 16th and 17th century. But when you read the artillery books, they're just nonsense. There's someone who's written an artillery book because he wanted to make some money. Someone comes along, copies it and puts his own slant on it. He makes some money. Someone else reads that and he does it. So actually you find a consolidation. And then we go back and we go, wow, it's got a 12-pounder and an 18-pounder. It doesn't. I don't believe it works like that. Sorry, that's a complete non-answer to a question. But
So what was it that gave the Bureau brothers the great advantage of casting on the round?
organisation. Not. I don't believe that the article about the. Has anyone actually redone the research about the Bureau brothers? No. We all use the same article in French. Do you know that I've forgotten so long ago since I tried to read it? It doesn't say it. It doesn't say they invented this new artillery. What they did is they organised it in a very superior way. So it's just how you look after it and how people and people do it. So I don't think. I'm not sure.
The gun was just the same.
I think so. That article, do you know the one I mean? Yeah, it's repeated and repeated and repeated all over the place. I don't think anyone reads it, ever. Took me a while to get a copy of it.
We have a question here.
Can I just ask you, sir, you mentioned the dramatic drop in price of gunpowder.
Yeah.
Why?
I think you mentioned Bert Hall, and he identified the late 14th century as being a big decrease in the price of gunpowder on the continent based on saltpeter plantations in northern Germany.
That's what we think so.
Now, based on the English evidence, it seems there was a delay in this occurring. So I wonder whether this was prompted by demand. So in England, they used them much more in the early 15th century, so in Wales or in the north of England, and this prompted, I don't know, international merchants to make an effort to get more gunpowder into England, and that brought the price down. But it's a very interesting area. Sadly, the documents I look at are just financial, so they say what's happening, not why. But it's intriguing.
Surely transport costs would rule out being able to undermine the market.
Well, I think the idea is originally saltpeter, and for a very long time came ultimately from India. And then the idea being that if you could obviously import it from Germany or Holland or somewhere else, that's obviously a much closer distance than obviously the other side of the world. There is a decrease in price there.
If you, Bert Hall treats this quite well, and it is impossible to be absolutely clear about it. But there is actually, he sees a rise in artillery on the continent in the 1380s, an increase in sizes, and what he then relates that back is to the production of saltpeter. Saltpeter is very hard to make, so it's expensive. And what seems to happen is they find new processes, or they are making a process, so they're being able to produce saltpeter in greater quantities at cheaper prices. Ergo, you can make bigger guns. Now, whether that's true or not, but that's Bert's argument, if I remember right.
Yeah, entirely possible. I think it's also linked to the expenditure of gunpowder. Obviously, if you're going to use it on a great scale, you need to make it affordable. So,
we won the 7 Years' War and the Wars of Independence. You know, a lot of wars in the 18th and 19th century on Indian gunpowder. We weren't actually interested. Well, we were, of course, in cottons and all those things. What we were going for was saltpeter, and saltpeter comes out of India, and it's hundreds, thousands of kilos, hundreds, if not millions of kilos. And it's under-researched completely.
One thing we haven't really touched on is the quantity of armaments that were being imported, especially from North Germany and from the Low Countries, into France and England during this period. I was surprised to find how much of the armour that was being worn early in the reign of Edward III, which we've always said is English, things like the Great Helms, Edward the Black Prince, Pembridge, our Great Helm, always said they're English. Well, Edward III, in the first few years of his reign, imported 103 of them. The Great Helms were made in England. The other 97 came either from Low Countries or from Cologne. So the odds on those Great Helms being English is not very many. And the same we talked, I think it was, who mentioned the Passau sword? Was that Malcolm? Yeah, and Henry V had two swords called Passau because they had blades that came from Passau in Germany. And most of our blades were imported from Germany. Most of our mail, all our good mail was imported from Germany or Lombardy in the 14th century. So, you know, we haven't really touched on that, but there's a huge arms trade coming into England in the late 14th and early 15th century.
I think possibly what she means through about the siege of Berwick might have been exaggerated. Because the Wardens of the March were complaining for years afterwards that the town walls of Berwick had been demolished by and they'd never been repaired. Which may sort of back up the point about why Henry V didn't want to demolish the walls of Rome and overseas the place.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that related to the walls at Berwick town itself, which had been, I believe from what I remember of reading about this, it's not a main area of interest to me in that, it was a place within the sort of area of interest of the Percys, the Northumberland panics when Henry approaches, so he flees into Scotland, the Scots get let into Berwick, and they cause a lot of destruction in the town. And I believe that's where it was. They damaged the town, but they actually withdrew into the castle itself, which is where the Royalists besieged them and caused, besieged them.
Did you actually mention the damage done by the English Royals? If memory serves me correct.
Okay, yeah, I think I've had to check that. Yeah, but I got to admit, using Walsingham was partly. I have to be entirely on this because it's a lovely quote. The accuracy of it, perhaps slightly more questionable, as you say, but I really love that quote. So,
I've got a question for Tom on the question of archery. One reads in lots of accounts run up to 1,000 Years' War of the archery tradition in England being founded on every able-bodied male between a certain age having to practice and on a Sunday and other days a week. Whenever I've read these accounts, I sort of feel this doesn't seem terribly credible. People having access to bows, to butts, to time in the life cycle of in the working cycle of an agricultural society. I can easily imagine someone passing a law to say you've got to do this. I have much greater doubt about the reality on the ground, people actually going and doing it. Well, what's your take on that?
On the take, how many people actually went out and practiced archery? And the fact they keep banning football is an indication to me that everyone actually wants to go out and play football and not do archery. I suspect it was very, very difficult to drag people down the butts on a Saturday and get them actually to practice archery. But there's no doubt about it, if you intend to do it seriously, and very many archers made a living out of fighting in the 100 Years' War, in order to be an accurate archer, you really do need to practice quite a lot, ideally from a quite young age. I have absolutely no doubt that a lot of archers did. But I'm not quite sure exactly when it starts happening, but I suspect that there's a veneer of historicity that's attached to it. Oh, we've always practiced archery, so you've got to go out and do it. And I think actually it comes in the early 14th century in a big way when we start adopting the longbow and the mass tactical use of the longbow. But because there's been a bit of archery going on before, you could say, well, we've always done this. You can't argue it's because we've always done it. But I think it's a very, very new development in the early 14th century.
And it's repeated in Elizabeth's reign. I was just reading Acts of Privy Council or something yesterday.
Oh, it's repeated
right through
until absolutely. Well, you've still got
1576.
Sir John Smythe is still writing in the late 1580s that we ought to be going back to the longbow because it's much more effective than the musket.
That's right.
Because the musket's so inaccurate.
So we shouldn't imagine that every village in England is chock full of men that have been, you know, fully trained up to fire arrows?
Oh yeah, I think we should. I think we should. And if you take, for example, Bridport, to take a random small town in England, we fortunately have a muster roll of 1450. Someone help me out here. 1451 is it? Which describes what bows and arrows the local muster turn up with, and they've got quite a lot. Bows and arrows is one thing they have got. Armour, jacks, salads is one thing they almost haven't got at all. They have hardly any defences whatsoever. And most of them are rocking up with a bow and a sheaf of arrows.
Yes. Could I just add to that? This is something that came up in one of the other sessions as well. There is the Statute of Winchester, which lays down obligations for people between the ages of 16 and 60 to provide military service for the defence of their home county. It also lays down a series of weapon obligations according to status. But the muster roll that you mentioned for Bridport, there are lots of other 14th century muster rolls for places in Middlesex, Suffolk, particularly in Norfolk, where you've got these people who are obliged under the statute to attend the view of arms once a year and actually to present their arms before the authorities.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see in those lists that there are people with bows. I mean, there are people there with domestic axes and staves as well.
Yeah.
There are lots of archers, and they're described as having bows, arrows, knife, swords, whatever.
That's right. Yeah.
So the evidence is quite strong, I think.
Yes.
Whether those rules survive.
I've got a question for Tom. First, I just want to say thank you very much for that. I'm currently writing my dissertation, partly a bit is on Agincourt and the superiority of the longbow on battlefield, so I found that immensely helpful. Well, my question to you is, when was the longbow first incorporated, not the longbow, but first incorporated into the English army in such large quantities?
Don't know. Go find out. I'll remember. There's bound to be someone else in this room that can answer that question, but I can't.
Somebody want to rebound from that? There was a question.
Just really for Dan, the English seem to have the edge in terms of artillery in the conquest of Normandy, the early parts of the 100 years, the Agincourt families, but they then seem to lose it following the death of Henry V. Is that perception real, or is it?
I think partly they have the edge because they're on the offensive. Henry's won at Agincourt, the French are in disarray, they've got the Civil War, and they can't organise themselves to effectively oppose him. So I don't think they necessarily have a sort of technological edge. As for later on, I think again they're much more organised in the 1440s, 1450s, early 1450s I should say. And that gives them the advantage. There is, mentioned the Bureau brothers, of course. I mean, this might be a little bit sort of controversial. I'm sure somebody from a French or Burgundian background could sort of counter me on this, but I do believe that the French, at least, were using a particular type of gun called serpentine before the English were. The earliest mention I found in English records is 1450, and it's interesting. These weapons suddenly appear in the accounts of Calais or expedition ones, and they explode in numbers. They go from sort of nothing to being in very large numbers. And it appears the French did have this weapon before then. And it's also interesting that in the 1450s, in the civil wars in England, these were the primary weapon used on the battlefield. So I would contend, of course, subject to anyone else ripping me to shreds for saying this, that the French did have a slight technical edge at that point. I think it's partly organisation, partly they've got greater resources, but also because of this perhaps slight technical edge, but I'm willing to be corrective maybe.
Can I just point out,
Yeah.
this is part of the problem, especially in the 15th century, you get a name like serpentine and it can mean anything from a cannon 12 feet long, because it specifically says it, to the implication that you're talking about a handgun. It's the same with bombards. I've got evidence of bombards from the Burgundian sources, and a bombard weighs 16,000 pounds and fires a ball, I forget now, and a bombard is 2 feet long and weighs 300 pounds. You end up, what's going on? You don't, and it's impossible. You almost have to you just have to say it. That's what they say. I haven't been able to sort it out.
In terms of the serpentines, it does seem clear because we do have some measurements for them.
Yeah,
they give them as very long guns with very small sizes shots.
Very small ball.
So I think the advantage that these have is they're very long guns, and I don't want to go too much of the discretion into the 1450s because I like this area. They tend to be used very much on the battlefield and at sea. They're very useful guns. I think that is a change. That's a contend.
Well, I think that the Burgundian artillery at the beginning of the 15th century was really excellent. In 1406, John the Fearless had 120 cannons to attack Calais, and not only big bombards, there are all types of cannon, and the big bombards like Bourgogne and so on, 3 tons, 8 tons, are some arm de prestige, of course, useful. For example, in 1409, 1410, all the historians of artillery knew Veléxon, the siege of the castle Veléxon, a little castle near the Saône, a bicoque, a little house, but we have all the accounts of the siege, and we have all the effort made by the Burgundians to concentrate around this little castle, beautiful artillery, and it worked. It worked at the end of the siege. It worked. They destroyed the wall of the castle, 300 feet of, and so on. So it worked, and I think that the phenomenon you described was a European phenomenon, and the interest of for Henry IV and Henry V for the artillery is exactly the same in Burgundy. For example, John the Fearless want to see some essays of bombard and so on. We have beautiful accounts about that. You know that, of course.
Exactly. No, I agree.
Very interesting, and I think that's a parallel phenomenon. You know. But what I had a question about because I worked a long time ago about the treaties of capitulation of Norman cities, you know, and in all the treaties you have a chapter about the artillery.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you if you have inventories, because some treaties mention that inventories had to be made of this artillery and powders and so on, because I think that for Henry V it had great importance.
Sadly not, no. I mean, because I've been looking at the records of the English Exchequer in great detail, sadly not the French archives, and I think it's very clear that they kept their different accounting.
English archives, you have no inventories after.
They don't have it. They don't have those inventories in France. I think they probably kept in sort of Lancaster in France, and their fate since then.
They don't survive yet.
Okay,
I need to.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
Thank you.
Back to the archers. Do you know if the archers used their own personal clothes that they were familiar with, had a feel of, or did they just grab one from the back of the cart?
Well, what we don't know very much. We do know a great deal about the way in which bows, arrows, and bowstrings were supplied for military service during the 100 Years' War from the Tower. What we don't know is how many bows the archers themselves brought with them, because we don't, unless anyone else has been studying individual records that records that. Though things like Bridport muster roll do indicate that a lot of archers, not professional soldiers, but locals, did have bows and arrows. So we don't know exactly. We suspect that you got issue. There do seem to be correlations between where we have the number of archers and the number of bows and other equipment that go on an expedition. There's a correlation. So it looks as if the Privy Wardrobe is actually in the 14th century supplying as much kit as the archers need, with no requirement for them to bring their own gear. But how much horse trading there is about, saying, well, this is a bit light for me, oh, swap, who knows how that worked.
A question for Tom. When looking at the Mary Rose going forward in time, there's an absence of crossbows found.
Yep.
So where do you think that is?
Crossbows were never very common on English ships. There are odd ones found, but they're not the common way of defending English ships.
And they're often used to fire incendiaries. That's what they become in the later part of the 16th century.
Yeah.
By the 16th century, when you were talking about
There's a huge fall off in crossbow production
Yeah.
anyway. Military crossbow production really goes down hugely in the 15th century.
But the ships would have half a dozen crossbows and fire arrows and things like that, and they would talk about incendiaries, and that comes in the 16th century right through the 17th century. But not.
I think we will thank our speakers for this intense discussion, very stimulating. Thank you very much.